And I think since I'm following Ashok, I think it's very difficult to talk after him because he is India's one of the finest China experts. And what he has laid down an expansive argument about the relationship, about the empirical realities that the relationship confronts, and some of the ways in which I think the two countries can try to manage this very important relationship. So I thought, what should I do? I think as a student of international relations, I would try to conceptualize the elements of this relationship. And since many of you are also students of IR or foreign policy or political science, I think a conversation along those lines and to develop a sort of a research agenda along those lines perhaps might be one way of following after Ashok's very fine presentation. So let's start. Let's think about Doklam for a minute. And if you go back to last year, that was that became emblematic of what was happening to Sino-Indian relations. For a moment, I think most of us who even followed Indian foreign policy closely, or who were following Sino-Indian relations very closely, were also taken aback, because this was something that no one had predicted would happen. This was something that I think even our diplomats did not think was hovering on the Sino-Indian relations landscape, and so I think at some level we were not prepared for what was happening on the border. But I think if you think, and I think Ashok also alluded to it, if you think about the trajectory of the relationship, there would have been an assessment that something, that the confidence that perhaps some of us had in Sino-Indian relationship to manage the border was perhaps a bit misplaced, because the argument always went that, look, the border with Pakistan is very, very volatile, but we have managed our borders with China very well. That's certainly a tribute to good diplomacy, but I think the underlying realities were such that something like Doklam was to happen one way or another. And so I think, when you look at Doklam and you look at the resolution of Doklam, which happened in the context of the 19th Party Conference, in the context of the BRICS Summit that happened after that, and the idea that the two political leaderships could come together, the diplomatic communities in the two countries could come together and resolve the problem, I think also tells us a certain story about the ability of China and India to resolve or to manage disputes, not resolve, but to manage. So this idea that we are capable of managing differences, even those differences that could have taken the form of the Doklam crisis. But the reality remains also that the underlying forces that are pushing this relationship in a certain direction, and again, that was alluded to by Ashok, remain where they were pre-Doklam. So I think a lot of the discussions, for example, there is a very sensationalist discussion in certain quarters of the media about where the troops are being positioned, how the border is being presented, where the new bases are being built along Doklam, and what is going to happen. I think some of that is merely a reflection of what is happening to our relationship at multiple levels. At least that's how I, as a student of international relations, would like to see this, or would like to approach this relationship. So if a lot of this so let's break this down. Let's look at the structural realities. What is happening to the structure of international environment? Again, we know that it is in flux. We know that it is uncertain. We know that traditional power structures are disappearing. We know that certain powers are rising and some powers are falling. The certitudes with which we have lived, or which we had lived since the end of the Cold War, are disappearing in front of our eyes. So this idea that new power realities, new power configurations are emerging is now taken as a given. So any student of international politics who has read The Rise and Fall of Great Powers would tell you that when powers rise and powers fall, something happens. And what it means that powers expand, certain powers contract, and that has an impact on the neighborhood, on the international system, on the international order. So as China rises, it's very natural that it's trying to expand its footprint. It's also very natural that that's causing a lot of consternation in its neighborhood, in those areas where countries are most vulnerable. So you see certain problems in its vicinity in East and Southeast Asia, and in South China Sea, the territorial disputes are widening. In South Asia, it's intruding into India's sphere of influence. And I think that is a structural reality India is confronting. And the reality is also that India is also rising. that that India is also responding to its own economic, military, and political rise. So you have two powers rising, and if China wants a unipolar Asia, India wants a multipolar Asia. So there is a contestation. Now again, this was the idea of the international system was one thing that bound us during the times of American hyperpower. So remember those good old days when Russia, China, and India used to come together. They still come together on the trilateral platforms and bemoan American unipolarity. But there was a time when they used to do it very regularly, and the idea was that we want multipolar world order. So both Indian, the Chinese, and the Russians used to say we like multipolar world orders primarily because that would allow us to constrain American hyperpower. Now the trouble is that the tables have been turned. So China is now the top dog, or at least trying to pretend to be the top dog, and therefore its idea of a multipolar world order looks very different from our idea of a multipolar Asia. So therefore, the contestation is in some ways inevitable, that we have very different understandings of what kind of geospatial matrix is going to emerge from our perspective and from their perspective. So in that sense, where US unipolarity actually, if you think about it, helped both India and China to develop, to integrate globally and to reap the benefits of globalization. Now the disappearance of it perhaps is something that we need to confront. After arguing for multipolarity for so long, we are now confronted with the consequences of what happens when a multipolar world order emerges. And when a multipolar world order emerges, it's not going to be seamless. There are going to be multiple alignments, multiple coalitions, multiple partnerships that countries have to engage with, and that's again is being reflected in the way, especially India is trying to manage its relationship. So it still invests in BRICS. It's still and it's still trying to do something with the Quad. The US, Japan, India, and Australia initiative. So I think that is a reality of the kinds of the world in which we live because of the structural changes that are taking place in the world. And China's rise in Asia, therefore, has a second set of consequences, which is that it is challenging the institutional frameworks and the normative order. So our problem, in many ways, is that the order through which we have benefited, through which we have lived over the past few decades, is also under tremendous stress. So when we talk of the Indian Ocean or the South China Sea and we talk of the maritime order, it's exactly this point that we are trying to make. When we talk of a free and fair trading system, free sea lanes of communication, we are looking at a landscape that is changing, and China as a rising power is challenging some of those normative assumptions which we have held so dear for so long. And I think that is a challenge that most of the countries who are in the same status as we are finding it difficult. Because on the one hand, you have American retreat and China's rise, both happening at the same time. And that means that our ability to manage this change in the normative flux is very limited, is getting restricted by the day. And no doubt, there are consequences. So if you look at the Indian Ocean, if you look at the South China Sea, it's the maritime order that we are most concerned about. If you look at Southeast Asia, for example, the ASEAN is under tremendous stress, again, partly because of what is happening at the structural level. China's ability to divide and rule in the ASEAN is a manifestation of the fact that the ASEAN is now riven from descent from within. And this allows a certain this is again a reflection of the fact that the certainty of those days when America used to be the security guarantor for Southeast Asia is gone. And China's rise is putting tremendous strain on an organization that was actually built partly to balance China. So we are looking at the consequences of a power transition in the system, and that consequences are being felt normatively, consequences are being felt institutionally, and that is a reflection again of the challenges that states like India continue to confront. And similarly, I think this was again mentioned, South Asia, there's a lot of discussion about China's ability to intrude into South Asia, and that is again a reflection of Chinese growing economic might and the way it could project power. There is, and again, I think this idea that if you will have this contestation, then China certainly would like to also make sure that it prevents other states from emerging. So it's no surprise that China does not want us in nuclear suppliers group. It's no surprise that China would want to band with Pakistan on issues which perhaps at times from our perspective may seem peripheral, like Masood Azhar's case, and many of us can question why is it that China is doing that, given that we have common threats of terrorism, Islamist extremism that we need to fight. But I think again, if you look at it structurally, a lot of this can be explained. And so that is, that is one prism through which you can understand the Sino-Indian relations and the sort of contestations that are happening at multiple levels. At another level, perhaps it's also interesting to sort of open up the black box and see within these states, so domestic politics and economic factors, domestic constituencies in these two countries. Do we have enough domestic stakeholders, for example, in India? Now, it's very interesting that there was a time when books were being written about Chindia, when books were being written that when ministers and governments used to say that India and China can collaborate, for example, in going out and bidding jointly for oil fields. So again, but those constituencies are disappearing. I don't think even the Communist Party members would today stand up and defend China in public platforms. I think it's getting very difficult because of what China is doing. So I think the constituencies that India used to have for pro-China, the sort of pro-Chinese constituencies are also, are disappearing by the day, because I think the larger reality of the relationship has taken over. Similarly, we are two different political systems, and there is often a problem that do we understand what is happening within China? And I don't think we have good China experts in this country. We have very few China experts who actually understand what is happening within China. And that is, again, a reflection of how the discourse on China tends to be either lopsided or derivative, or induced by what is happening in other countries, etc., etc. But I think the larger reality is that domestic politics and domestic societies, the interactions remains relatively limited. We have a problem that given the authoritarian nature of China, there is a lack of transparency in the system. We continue with other countries. We also contest this problem that we don't know how much, for example, China is investing in defense. There is a big issue about the number. There is also the centralization of power that is happening in China has caused a big problem. The economic dimension, Ashoka alluded to it. It's not there yet. It's growing. China is the largest trading partner, but again, the problem is of trade deficit. Again, the problem is how do you expand? How do you open up Chinese markets for Indian goods? So I think, by and large, what we are looking at, at a relationship at the domestic level, where, as a political scientist, when we try to understand this, we will look at domestic constituencies. Which are the constituencies that will promote a certain country, promote a certain country's interests, and I don't see that in this case, and vice versa. It's both sides. So I think that is also a reflection of the fact of an inability to comprehend the magnitude of the change that is happening in Sino-Indian relations. Finally, and very, I think, briefly, I would also mention that if you bring the prism down to the individual level explanations, those are also very interesting. After all, a lot of Chinese assertion is happening under Xi Jinping, who has articulated a certain approach to world affairs, who has given up this idea that China can stand back. China needs to stand back and bide its time. He wants to be very assertive in global politics. Similarly, we have a new government in India which has a certain view about India's role in the world. So go back to 2012, when we were writing documents like Non-Alignment 2.0. Today we are talking of India as a leading power. So I think there is a difference in terms of how we approach the questions from two different perspectives. The idea that you have a new leadership in the country, the idea that you have a vision for the country that is very distinct from the kind of approach that we used to take about India's role in the world, where India should be a balancing power, India should be a non-aligned power. I think that terminology has been very rightly buried. And in that place, there is a newfound self-confident assertion of Indian interests. And what that means for India, of course, it would mean that we are going to, there is going to be some tussle with countries who don't see eye to eye with India on certain issues. So when you do that, I think certain aspects of this can be understood in terms of what is happening to Sino-Indian relations. And therefore, I think a lot, perhaps because the underlying factors, as I was highlighting, both structurally, domestic, political, and economically, as well as individual level explanations, tell us a very pessimistic story. So I'm very happy that Ashok ended his talk with a very optimistic story, that there are possibilities in the relationship. There are things that the diplomats on the two sides and other constituencies on the two sides can do to manage this relationship. But because I think in the long term, this is going to be a very difficult relationship to manage, and therefore we need our best minds to get together and think of a possible way in which we can manage this relationship, so that at least in the short to medium term there are no there is no possibility of being going away from the central track which I think India needs is to continue to pursue its economic modernization and military modernization and political advancement. And I think if that is the alternative, then we don't want to be sidetracked by distractions from China. But I think the underlying realities as a student, as a scholar of international relations, if you're trying to study, if you're trying to find out some sources of where this problem is coming from, I think there's this 3-level of analysis framework perhaps helps illuminate some of the things that very nicely Ashoka did empirically. Thank you so much.